The rise and fall of images of the future precedes and accompanies the rise and fall of cultures. In the end, the future may well be decided by the image, which carries the greatest spiritual power. That was Fred Pollock, who was one of the early futurists. Or another way to put it is, the best way to determine the future is to create it. And that was from Peter Drucker. What we want to start out with connects to both the New Age and modern art and other cultural forces we've been talking about in previous episodes, mainly this British Empire of ideas. How does that present itself in America in recent times? Also today, let's talk about the fundamentals. Who controls the world? What is it exactly they believe? What do they want? And what are they going to do to get it? Kyle, do you want to start off?
What I want to sort of start out with is the idea that oligarchy, or the few, sort of ruled by the few for the few, it's not exactly a unified conspiracy. It's not like these guys are all sitting around a round table or they all know where their orders are coming from. But it's more like a community of interests where people who sort of compete and sort of cooperate are all protected by something like mutually assured destruction. I'd start that with 3 points. Number one, the power of oligarchs is based on property, whether that's money or land or ownership or some kind of legal title. Number two, that property is based on theft, whether it's because literally they stole it in some kind of an imperial conquest or through organized criminal activities or through usury or through, basically non-wealth producing activities for the most part is where the super rich got their money in the first place. And then number three, the perpetuation of that system of oligarchy is all based on the desire of oligarchs not to have their property expropriated by the public.
So you're saying the oligarchs have stolen what they have, and any of them can be called out at any moment by the public through the judicial system?
The oligarchs have stolen their ancestors stole what they have. To keep what they have, they basically need to keep a wall between themselves and the public. And even though those oligarchs, they compete and they have competing interests, like, for example, the people who own the coal industry compete with the people who own the oil industry to some extent, or the natural gas industry or something like that. Both of those people need to protect themselves from fusion reactors. Oligarchs cannot be reformed, and this comes from Plato even. You can't really, if you try to convince oligarch A to fight oligarch B, then you're going to make a new enemy out of oligarch C, and the whole thing just kind of goes round and round because they sort of have these interlocking interests. In recent times, and going all the way back to antiquity, the Venetian system, or even going all the way back to ancient Greece, the oligarchs basically have two recurring themes. One is the idea that there's a growing population and dwindling resources, and those two things are about to collide. And then number two is that because of that, we need to radically reduce, suppress, and transform the population according to basically the needs or the prerogatives of oligarchs. In recent times, that would be things like H.G. Wells' Open Conspiracy, Huxley's Brave New World, The Limits to Growth paper by the Club of Rome, The Population Bomb by Paul Ehrlich, who's from Stanford University. The first quote I read is from something called Changing Images of Man by the Stanford Research Institute that's all about this. Kissinger has a famous thing called NSSM 200, where he talks about the threat of third world population growth. There's something called the Aquarian Conspiracy by Marilyn Ferguson that's about this. Eco-Science, which is by Obama's science advisor, John P. Holdren. We need to ask two questions that parallel the two issues of the oligarchs. Number one, is it true that resources are dwindling and his population is growing, and basically we're running up into a wall of resource scarcity? If that is true, then to some extent the oligarchs are probably right, that we are going to run out of resources and we're all doomed, and somebody needs to step in and manage that process so that there's not a cataclysm. If it's not true, then we need to ask, why do oligarchs constantly repeat this all throughout history. And I think either it's because it's a lie that the inner oligarchs do not believe, but they have sort of this coterie of economists and scientists and stuff to push that idea on the population. The whole point is just to stop that population from becoming free of the oligarchs and from, like I said before, expropriating their property. Or B, they're convinced of the idea because they're incompetent and they're just totally unfit to be in power. Question number 2 is, if we do in fact have the ability to have sufficient resources regardless of population growth, then what's our vision of the future that's going to counteract that vision of the elites? And I think you can see from the way that they put it, they believe that the vision precedes the reality. And I think if they've got a vision, which is in all of these books, you go back to The Open Conspiracy by H.G. Wells, that's basically what, all the John Birchers and stuff would call global government or the New World Order, where it's basically very limited individual freedom and very centralized decision-making on things like resource usage. And that's their vision. What's our vision going to be?
I guess let's start with the idea of population growth and resource scarcity. We've talked in the last couple of episodes about why population reduction always seems to come up. With Ebola happening right now, the recent climate march, and Bindi Irwin's viral YouTube video, this is back in the news. People talking about the growth of population. Can Africa hold this many people, and ideas like that? There are 2 representative points of view I often hear. From the left, that the population is out of control and increases exponentially. When you hear that 7 billion people will only increase exponentially, that's terrifying. They also often talk about the resources used by the middle class and how the middle class lifestyle cannot spread to places like Africa, India, or China. On the right, you will often hear there is no population problem and the entire world population could fit into the state of Texas. However, those 2 points of view aside, I always like to go back to the British Empire's geostrategic policy and how population affects their control of the planet and its resources. It's imperialism. And how do these large populations affect their imperial goals?
You look at the population of America. That's no longer a issue for them, really. We have an entire continent with 350 million. We looked up the population today of Africa, and it surprised me. I actually thought it would be a lot lower, but it was 1.1 billion.
Mm-hmm.
So if the British Empire had given them all the resources to industrialize and become their own superpower, they would have to compete with Africa. Then you've got the population of China, which is in the billions. And then you've got populations like Canada. What was Canada?
It was about 130 million, something like that.
And then Australia was something like
50 million, I think.
Yeah. So the only populations they're concerned with, and also the population of Russia is only 140 million. So that's about a third of ours, right?
Yep.
So the only populations they're concerned about, let's simplify this, is India's population, Africa's population, and China's population.
Right.
They're not concerned with Russia's population, but they're concerned with Russia's technology.
Now, are they really concerned, though, as they would have us believe, that China and India and Africa, basically, as they modernize, well, all of these people are going to want automobiles and TVs and blah, blah, blah. And so we're running out of food, we're running out of oil, we're running out of, rare earth minerals and all these kinds of things.
Do they actually believe their own green mythology? Or are some of the more popular green ideas actually a mythology? We have to break that down. Does the ruling class in England, who wants to keep domination of the world, buy into their own green ideologies, or is this just an intelligence operation to get the rest of us to live with less?
And I think there's 2 levels to this. One is basically they're lying about certain resources being scarce. This is going to offend and shock some people, but you look at something like oil, the theory that oil is biotic or comes as a fossil fuel.
Is rotted material.
Right. Is, dinosaur juice and rotted right. ferns and stuff. However those dinosaurs got to the bottom of the ocean, we'll never know. I don't know if we want to touch that. That theory is controversial in certain places. That Russian scientists don't believe that in peak oil, they don't believe in biotic oil. They believe oil is basically it comes out of a geological process.
Yeah, but I think we can all agree whether oil regenerates itself and there is no such thing as peak oil. Mm-hmm. It's not a good fuel source, Kyle.
No, I agree. No, let's not call it fossil fuel, but call it a hydrocarbon.
Okay, well, I don't think anybody thinks that hydrocarbons are an ideal fuel source.
No, I would agree. I think that there's a certain convenience to them because it's easy to ignite them in an internal combustion engine and get the thing to run. You can get a lot of efficiency out of the new diesel engines and stuff like that. There's a whole series of complicated arguments.
But I haven't met a left person or right person or anybody that, says to me, oh, fracking is the way forward.
No, absolutely not.
Right.
In any event, yeah, like you're saying, you don't want to have an entirely hydrocarbon economy or, energy system. But on one hand, there is some suspicion that, in fact, we don't have scarcity of those kinds of materials. But then on the other side is the fact that we have the ability as human beings to expand and develop new resources.
Well, before we switch topics on this, can I just make one point that I think the average person wrestles with? We all of us struggle with mythologies and try to figure things out on a daily basis. If the ruling elite, the majority of the ruling elite, care so much about pollution, which everybody cares about, people can be pro-climate change or anti-climate change, but everybody can agree they don't want pollution, they want clean water and clean air. Everybody agrees with that. So if the elite's concern was global warming, they could easily retool hydrogen cars. You telling me all these patents aren't out there or these ideas haven't been developed? I remember when I was a young kid, my dad developed a hydrogen engine in our garage. I swear to God that happened unless that was a dream I had. He said, look at this, I developed a hydrogen engine. So my dad spent a lot of his life being a mechanic and fixing airplanes. That's how he started out in Vietnam. He was an airplane mechanic. So my dad's mechanically inclined, and I remember him building a hydrogen engine. You're telling me we can't retool our cars to hydrogen? I'm just saying if the elite were so concerned, where are they on this?
They do have hydrogen cars. I mean, it's basically it's just a compressed gas, kind of like having a propane tank on the back of a car. They have buses in certain cities and stuff run on that. Or how about this? Why can't it just be synthetic gasoline? Meaning, the Nazis had synthetic fuel for their tanks. They created it out of coal. If you had enough energy coming out of a nuclear power plant, you could use waste energy to produce synthetic petroleum out of crop wastes and garbage and who knows what. A hydrocarbon, it's hydrogen and carbon. So what do you have? You've got carbon dioxide, you've got hydrogen and water. Basically, these are simple elements. The entire crust under the crust of the earth is just like a sea of methane gas, and methane is the
But wouldn't that produce emissions, which doesn't solve the problem anyway?
No, I mean the problem with emissions and coming out of petroleum has more to do with contaminants in the gas and stuff. If you're just looking at a hydrocarbon as hydrogen and carbon, you're just going to be emitting water basically if you can get it to combust clean enough. But it gets at the point of resource scarcity is defined by current technology. And some people will ridicule this idea by calling someone with my point of view like a cornucopian or a technological utopian. But let's give a concrete example of the idea of energy density. So you can measure basically, it's called specific energy. It's measured in millijoules, which is a measurement of energy per kilogram weight of the energy source. So if you're talking about, let's just go with gasoline, petroleum, it's 44 millijoules per kilogram. If you're talking about uranium, like in a nuclear power plant, 80 million millijoules per kilogram. And petroleum is, the only thing that's used as a fuel, the highest thing below uranium and thorium, which are these, which are radioactive elements. The highest thing on the list is hydrogen at 142 millijoules per kilogram. So basically, the jump between these conventional energy sources we have just sitting around on the ground And uranium and thorium, for example, is just like an infinite jump. So if you go to a nuclear economy, well, gee, then all of a sudden energy scarcity seems kind of silly.
Right.
Because thorium, for example, I'm not quite as up on the most recent designs for traditional nuclear power plants, but like a thorium power plant, people can get some of this information by going to Energy from Thorium or the Thorium Energy Alliance. There are scientists that are trying to resurrect this technology and promote it, and they're putting a lot of money into it in China and I think in India.
So instead of giving the elite giving $85 billion a month to Wall Street and spending all this money to organize this climate march in advertising,
you could spend about $1 billion to develop thorium power plants, and you would solve quote-unquote global warming and any energy scarcity concerns in about a year. Absolutely.
You think it would take just $1 billion?
To do the research and development. It would not to actually deploy all of these power plants.
Okay, and then we could power our cars as electric cars.
As electric cars or with synthetic petroleum in like a highly efficient diesel engine or...
So there's a ton of options, and we haven't changed options in hundreds of years.
Yep.
But the point is that the oligarchs of the planet aren't putting any resources, and that's a fact, because we discovered that we spend less money on researching new forms of clean energy than we do on dog food in the other episode. Mm-hmm. So if they cared so much, they can't mobilize to find us better sources of fuel. Yes, they can. And it's not because the oil oligarchs are holding them back.
Right.
I think it's so they continue to have this excuse. They don't care because they continue to have this excuse that humans are polluters. It's not so much to defend the oil oligarchs and to keep them in power. It's more to keep us out of power.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what it is. Because you just think about, I always come back to energy because it's such a central, it would be sort of like a flywheel that powers all of these new industries and new possibilities. Like, if you're concerned about pollution, and why would you not be, just imagine what, basically infinite energy would allow you to do. Maybe, there are people that talk about technology to transform garbage back into its base elements. Throw your old TV into basically a big furnace and turn it back into copper and iron and whatever the heck is in there.
That sounds polluting. Burning TVs? What do you mean?
Well, I don't mean like in an actual fire. I'm saying just basically having having technology to do. Okay, let's take another example. Having seawater desalination. Mm-hmm. The reason it's not done now is because it's not affordable. It just takes too much energy to get out clean water, and go beyond thorium power, go beyond nuclear power, and go to nuclear fusion, which is like this ITER thing. Seawater is your fuel source, and your byproduct is clean drinking water. Right.
They're not putting any resources into this. They're putting super minimal resources. I mean, the government's putting a little bit into funding the research and development into this stuff, but we're talking, like we said, not as much as dog food per year.
Right. Why are the oligarchs then so concerned and concerned since the beginning of oligarchy with this idea of growing population, dwindling resources? Every one of these books that I listed before, if you look at like the population bomb, makes these wild predictions. It's similar to like the global warming thing, where if we don't act now, in 5 years, the oceans are all going to rise 20 feet, and we're, like the population bomb or the limits to growth. It's basically like by 1975, the world is going to have 1 person per square foot, or, something crazy like that. When in fact, you look at the world population and
many areas it's decreasing.
Yeah, many areas it's decreasing, absolutely. And in most areas, the growth rate is decreasing.
Like I said, my grandfather was one of the heads of the United Nations Population Council, not a eugenicist, but he worked there. People are just suffering from so many mythologies right now. Population is decreasing in many areas. In many areas, if you go to Europe now, it's really, they talk about the beautiful people in France and the beautiful people in Italy. Mm-hmm. If you're on a city street in France or Italy, all you see are old people.
Right.
Not that old people aren't beautiful, but you know what I mean? You don't see explain. I was shocked by how much the population was aging, and you never see a baby cart being pushed.
And you look around, I mean, I'm in the Chicago area, but you look around here and all the people I know who are in their, they didn't have kids at a young age. Now they're in their 30s, some like nearing 40 or in their 40s. And when they try to have kids, they can't do it. There are fertility problems. People are doing in vitro or doing hormone therapies. And, I grew up in a family of 5. A lot of people I knew grew up in families of, 3, 4, 5. Mm-hmm. And now it's almost rare to find families of 2.
Right.
Or, with 2 kids, I mean.
Yeah. They have successfully pushed a lot of this global warming, population reduction mythology onto us, and they're going to continue to do so. It's only going to get worse from here on out post this climate march.
Right.
So they're concerned with the population of Africa and India, but mostly they're concerned with them industrializing.
Right. Let's take another example, the example of food. If it's just how are we going to feed this growing population? The U.S. is, I think, still the biggest exporter of grain in the world. We export to all kinds of places. Some people are starting to ban U.S. grain imports for various reasons, like Russia and China, over fears of GMO contamination. I think that's basically cover for they're trying to develop their own agricultural sector. But we grow more corn than anyone in the world. 40% of it is used for ethanol, which is like the fuel blend that you find in your gas tank. 40% of the corn is used for animal feed. 10% of it is exported, and then 10% of it is turned into food. So
if we went off ethanol, then we would have 40% more corn.
Yeah, or whatever the math is. But right, basically double the Iowa farmland just by getting rid of ethanol. And we don't, you could just replace it with gasoline tomorrow. The only reason ethanol is there is some, fear of peak oil or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. Maybe we don't need to get into this one, but even with like animal feed, just like the inefficiency of feeding corn to animals and then eating the animals in terms of like what's the footprint of doing that? How much water is used, how many... Instead
of irrigating grazing land through desalination, or like you said, redirecting the energy flow from the melting ice caps in Canada or whatever.
Yeah, or how about let's maybe eat more potatoes and less KFC. We might all be healthier too, but maybe we don't want to go there.
No, it's okay. I mean, it's a really painful subject. How we treat our animals. All of these major reforms affect all these other things we care about. Right now, there are animals suffering in factory farms all over the world, and that's unnecessary.
Yeah, well, and with the issue of why are we producing so much meat, I think a lot of these, the documentaries got it wrong, these King Corn and the Michael Pollan stuff, where basically they're saying we're subsidizing people to grow corn. Well, that's not really it at all. It's that the price is so cheap that they have to grow as much corn as possible, and that cheap subsidy basically keeps alive these concentrated animal feeding operations and the whole, basically we said it on a previous show, we're a grain colony for the world. Mm-hmm. We are set up to basically export meat around the world, to export cheap grain around the world, wheat or soybeans or whatever it is, to export cheap animal feed. People talk about like, oh, they're cutting down the rainforest for cows in Brazil or whatever. Well, where is that feed coming from? Some from Argentina, but most of it is coming from those American farms. That's exporting. 40% of your best farmland is turning into GMO corn and soy that's going to go feed cows in Brazil that are going to turn into a $1.99 hamburger.
If we had abundant free, clean energy, then we could also have abundant free, clean water, which would mean that we would have more grazing area for animals to live humanely, and we could bring animals back onto the land and all that stuff we were talking about in the parody show. Yeah,
and if you have the fair price paid to the farmers so that they can actually afford to do any of that. Do you want to get into... Okay, if the vision of the what is the vision of the oligarchs in your mind? For, when you look at Brave New World or you look at the Open Conspiracy or these kinds of things, what is it that these people really want, and how does that sort of fit into their where they derive their power.
Well, your social position determines your social consciousness, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then when you get into the position of becoming an oligarch, unless you're, and then there's those who are born into it mostly. But when you get into that position, all of a sudden, it's easy to go to that place in your mind that's anti-people, pro-population reduction. Because you don't have necessarily an educated context to place those feelings. Meaning, if we became billionaires tomorrow, if we suddenly became billionaires after all of our political work, even if we had those types of instincts, we'd understand how to consciously put them in the right place. Manage those feelings when you are a fully formed, self-realized, conscious person.
Right.
What is the mindset of most oligarchs? It's not good. It's all population reduction, and it's environment before people. I heard this analogy one time that we're so desensitized to human suffering, but yet we're not yet as desensitized to animal suffering. And remember that story back during the Iraq War when that soldier threw a puppy off a cliff?
Mm-hmm.
The whole world went nuts, but yet we can see on a daily basis, babies with their heads blown off and faces blown off, and nobody really bats an eye. We've been desensitized over a long period of time to human suffering. And we also have this feeling, humans can speak up for themselves, so animals have that disadvantage. So we put animals and the environment before people. We believe that it's other people that are the enemies of the animals and the environment.
I just think that even among oligarchs, there are certain mythologies which they believe. Like, to take a sort of contrary example to this idea of environmentalism, is you look at Ayn Rand. Look at the sort of the message of Atlas Shrugged and Anthem and all these things, which is basically, you, the elite, are the producers of wealth in the society, and everyone else is a parasite who deserves to die. And if you walked away tomorrow, they'd all drop dead because they couldn't fend for themselves. From my personal experience, there are a certain class of people who are just fanatically dedicated to that idea. And those people tend to be ones that do not produce actual utility for society. They're ones that produce money for themselves, usually through some kind of a scam or, people just that believe the mythology that money equals wealth equals value to the world. And if you have money, it's because you deserve it, and you're the job creator. It's like this guy, Peter Schiff, who was Ron Paul's economic advisor, is always talking in those kind of terms, where I created this many jobs, but his career is managing a hedge fund that steals money from people.
Yeah, you created a bunch of parasites, which is not really a job.
Yeah, it's like saying you run a crack team of thieves that goes around stealing, robbing houses, and that makes you a job creator.
Yeah, Wall Street speculation is not a job.
Right. Do the elites actually...
Watch somebody trying to prove it in their mind right now. They're like, yes, it is. And they're trying to think about it right now. I'm going to prove it is. Shut up.
We talked about this before, about the idea that there's like the inner elite create the mythologies, and then like they have the mythologies for the masses, and then they even have mythologies for the outer elites, meaning, that might be doctors and scientists and educators and journalists and those kind of people who are sort of the people who keep the mythology machine running.
Mm-hmm.
Is all of this stuff, the idea of like the need to reduce the population, is that just for those people to believe? Is it just to create like an industry of climatologists or an industry of, whatever it is, people who are worried about population and that kind of thing?
I don't understand how you mean just to create an industry. They don't seem to be concerned with creating any industries.
Or not industry, but meaning like they create these fields to sort of perpetuate the mythologies through academia and through the media and stuff like that. I'm just wondering, at the end of the day...
Yeah, I got another from my stepdad before we started recording. He said to me, 100% of qualified scientists agree that global warming is real.
Right. Qualified by whom,
Yeah. What would you do if you were suddenly the ruler of the world? You know what? I think this is important. I'm just not playing a dumb game, but I think this is important. That I think everybody should ask themselves this.
Mm-hmm. What would you do if you woke up tomorrow and you were a noble tyrant?
What would you do? And ask yourself, because you know what? A lot of my friends who act like they're these activists, leftists, whatever, even right-wing activists, just these like pro-human race. You know what they say to myself? They go, God, maybe they're right. Maybe we should decrease the population.
Mm-hmm.
That's a weird instinct, like any other base instinct. Remember that Stanford experiment where if you could cause pain to another person without them knowing?
Right.
That most people did it?
Right.
Right? That's a shadow area of our psyche.
Yeah.
And that's a taboo. If you were in charge of the planet, what would you do? I'll name one and then maybe you name one or vice versa. But I would like to know, in all honesty, what would be like some of your first policy choices?
And you could just kind of go down the list from the United Front Against Austerity policies. For me, I think the most effective and immediate, the most bang for your buck right away would be to nationalize the Federal Reserve and just start flooding the real economy with zero interest credit, because you would completely undercut a big part of Wall Street, and you would basically give people the means to undertake projects of large infrastructure all the way down to you'd allow somebody to refinance their house at zero interest.
Instead of giving $85 billion at 0% to Wall Street, you'd reroute that money to productive.
You would just flood the economy with like $10 trillion and say, all right, nobody has to pay interest anymore.
For what?
For infrastructure. Let's start there. Roads, sewers, bullet trains, all the way to water desalination. You want to...
I'm just playing devil's advocate, not to interrupt you. People would say, we already have sewers. But I talked to a guy on the street in Nebraska who was in charge of the infrastructure for the sewage system there, and he said that he started to cry, and he said to me, some of my friends ask me how bad it is, and I don't want to tell them.
Yeah.
We're working on a 100-year-old or more sewage plant.
What was the city Dan was campaigning there? Was it Kearney where they actually had a water main or something burst and flooded the hospital? It was something like, or the sewer backed up. I looked that up.
Oh, yeah. I forgot. Yeah.
And right away I happened upon a historical photo, and it was literally from like 1896 when they were laying the sewers that were still being used in the town. We're talking about not very thick iron pipe built in 1896.
So redoing our sewers, most people can't relate to what it even means to redo our sewers. Like they'd say, oh, who cares? What's that going to do for me? We're going to redo our sewers. My sewer's working fine. When I flush my toilet, I'm fine.
Yeah, it works just fine until shit starts backing up into your house and ruins your entire house.
I'm really trying to think of things that can relate to people, because I really think that our platform does not practically relate. People think it's too abstract because it's all economic.
For anyone out there that has a mortgage, that gets my wheels turning when you just think about, you go look at your mortgage statement, and it's always done sort of so that up front you're paying mostly interest, and then on the back end you're paying mostly principal, or like the actual value of the loan. Take the interest out of there completely. Right now you've got a 30-year loan.
Oh, so you just jumped to Federal Reserve financing at 0% your primary mortgages.
Yeah, I'm just saying let's move past infrastructure. We can come back to that. Just on a very selfish and simple level, take all of the interest payments out of your loan. Let's say
student loans too,
and your student loan, but especially a mortgage. Let's say you've got a $200,000 mortgage. Over 30 years, you'll probably pay about $200,000 in principal and another $200,000 in interest. So just cut your mortgage in half. How would you like to do that basically at no cost to anybody? It's the same kind of principle, because you look around.
That's exciting. And basically we can do that by nationalizing the Federal Reserve.
You could do it like that. There's no theoretical problem why it won't work. It's been done in other ways in the past. The only reason it's not being done is because sitting out there is Bank of America and they want their cash.
It's because it's not being done because the public isn't demanding it, because mass traction issues are legalizing marijuana, which whatever. Get all the black youth out of jail, please, immediately. Nobody should be in jail for drug possession. We get that.
Well, it's like, really, yeah, go smoke your joint and enjoy your job at Starbucks and your overpriced home.
You can't even afford a home if you're working at Starbucks and smoking your joints. You'll spend all your money you make from Starbucks buying joints once it's all legal to live in your mom's basement. That's a great future.
To go back to infrastructure, so, you've got the sort of mundane stuff, like there was an interesting one from California where they use this thing called a capital appreciation bond in a school district. It was basically like the district had a number of schools, let's say like 10 schools. They needed to do updates to certain things. They needed to weatherize them. They needed new roofs. They needed to fix a couple of the HVAC systems, that kind of thing. And I can't remember the exact numbers offhand. They had to borrow from the future value of the real estate, and that became their collateral. And then up front, they paid no interest for like 5 years. And then after 5 years, the interest payments ballooned, so that over the life of the loan, which was like 30 years, they paid the principal of the loan 10 times over in interest. Just really quick, say it was $100,000 worth of repairs that needed to be done. They didn't have the cash. They were going to pay $1 million for this loan because they didn't have, because they couldn't satisfy bond investors that they were creditworthy. So basically, tell those bond investors to go to hell. Here's your $100,000. Pay us back in even increments with no interest over the next 50 years. And that doesn't cost anybody anything. And it can be done tomorrow.
But people have it can't be done tomorrow because people have an inbuilt defeatist idea. Like Webster had said, they've been down so long, they don't know what up is.
Mm-hmm.
If you say to them, you can demand 0% loans on a first house from the Federal Reserve, and use the Federal Reserve as a national bank, you know what they're going to say immediately? A $200,000 house would be worth $1 million if that ever happens. I'm not a socialist, but I've studied every type of revolution there ever was.
Mm.
And I was thinking about this in terms of the progression from what Engels learned to when he went to England and met Marx, to when Lenin finally implemented the revolution in Russia. What the big reality they came to before Lenin, Marx's philosophy was that the workers were going to naturally, it was inevitable. He said that it was inevitable that if things kept going the way they were going, the workers were going to organize and become revolutionaries, right?
Mm-hmm.
What broke their hearts so much is that the workers never did.
Yeah.
They just kept taking their pay and they never did. And Marx started to wrestle with this, Engels started to wrestle with this, but then finally Lenin said, I'm going to give a rebuttal to one part of this argument that I think it was called revisionist socialism.
Mm-hmm.
It came from a guy after Marx and Engels who after they died took over the Socialist Party, and he did a form of socialism called revisionist socialism. And he said, "I've got to revise one part of Marx and Engels' theories that the workers are ever going to revolt."
Mm-hmm.
He said because it doesn't seem to be happening. What we need are professional revolutionaries to do the work for them. That when Lenin took power, he did it with a handful of people.
Right.
And he took power of Russia. I mean, it was awful. It was done the wrong way. It was bloody, brutal. People were sent to concentration camps who were against them. It was not a pretty thing. But the point is how can we get the masses to get behind something like nationalizing the Federal Reserve? If you said that's your first thing you'd implement if you rule the world, you'd have to do a mass propaganda campaign and get these people to demand it. Are people going to understand that enough to demand it is what I mean. What that means.
Let's go back to Plato. And this is something. So you've got the oligarchs. The oligarchs are the few. You've got the possibility of a mob or a autocracy, which is basically, what you're talking about, the proletarian revolution. Mm-hmm. And then you've got the tyrant. And the tyrant doesn't necessarily mean he's a bad... That's where, where he comes in with this idea of the noble tyrant, is that basically if the will of the people is vested in, a ruler who represents their interests, it's that ruler or that sort of cabal of rulers who makes it happen. And I think that's kind of what you see with... Look at the New Deal. Look at what Abraham Lincoln accomplished. Look at the American Revolution. That's what you see in the history of America. It's not the workers rising up. It's not
The workers made a lot of strides in, labor strikes.
Sure.
But did they do what, like we were saying earlier, the philosopher king could do?
Right. Well, and there do need to be intermediaries in the process, but like let's take the issue of parity agriculture, which we talked about previously on this show. You had farmers getting absolutely just decimated during the whole Dust Bowl era. During, I talked about before my ancestors in Wisconsin, how they just lost everything and were just living, hand to mouth, and people were really, really hurting. But the farmers didn't all get together and say, we need a fair price. They had the instinct to know when they saw it that the fair price was what they needed. But the people that got this through were a very small group of basically academics and activists. The thing that got it through was Roosevelt. Mm-hmm. It wasn't that this idea originated within Roosevelt. It wasn't that he was the key architect of it or anything, but it was because Roosevelt was the elected president of the United States in a system where the president has a lot of power. Mm-hmm. And he was the kind of guy that knew a good idea when he saw it. He fought for it, and he exerted pressure in the right places, and it happened.
We need professional revolutionaries in service to a program. There's this idea that activism and revolutionary activity is something you do on the side. Mm-hmm. You have a job, and then maybe you go to a protest here and there, or you do it on the weekends or at night. And I don't believe that at all. There should be such a thing as a professional revolutionary.
Yeah, and once in a while you need a good town hall meeting or a good demonstration or whatever, but just this idea that we're going to all just hit the streets and hold up signs and yell forever and something is going to happen. It's like...
No, the elite have strategists, Kyle.
Yeah.
The elite hire Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski. The people should have their own strategists.
Right.
Strategists who come up with a platform to end this economic depression, and we then are in service to the right platform.
Right.
As a unified group, we say we recognize that platform, and then the public is in service to that platform, and the professional revolutionaries make sure that they don't stray. Same way that Alexis Tsipras has done in Greece, where he's gaining power.
Right.
He's a professional revolutionary in service to a program, and the people can recognize what he's doing is good.
Well, and you hit on an interesting point that goes back to the very beginning, where we're talking about these people. I've just been reading this thing called Changing Images of Man. It's a sort of infamous report that was put up by the Stanford Research Institute. Basically, it's predicated on this idea of resource scarcity and the need to transform society. It was put together by a group of...
Good old Stanford and their resource scarcity.
Yeah. It was put together by a group of people that included a number of British intelligence figures, but also like Margaret Mead, that woman who's an anthropologist, Joseph Campbell, who's the guy who wrote The Hero of a Thousand Faces, people like that. So their thing, and this was sort of followed up in this book, The Aquarian Conspiracy, was basically what we need to cope with the need to reduce the population is something like a global New Age culture. And it sounds crazy. I mean, just think about this. These are, Stanford professors emeritus.
Well, they'll kick you out of Stanford if you talk about the things that we're talking about in this radio show. Many of my family members are Stanford professors. I have an uncle who was a physics professor who developed the Stanford Linear Accelerator. I have a grandfather who was one of the heads of the science department. Mm-hmm. He came close, or I think he won a Nobel Prize for metallurgy. A lot of my relatives are Stanford professors. They've told me you can't talk about these subjects at Stanford. It's very politically correct. There was a Stanford professor recently who did a YouTube speech I saw actually about him getting kicked out of Stanford because he made this exact same argument about resource scarcity that we're making today. And he was fired from Stanford after 30 years.
Well, there you go. And so this group of people comes together and they say, we are going to forcibly transform society into basically, Burning Man times 350 million people. Mm-hmm. And just we're going to promote, New Age religion. We're going to promote non-traditional marriage. We're going to promote drug use. We're going to, anything and everything that people... It's kind of, you can see it today if you look with a jaundiced eye at something like Zeitgeist or even someone like David Icke, where it's this sort of the questioning of all traditional modes of living and sort of reforming in this sort of communalist idea. Maybe David Icke is not a fair example there, but... Yeah.
So if you were king of the world, you'd immediately nationalize the Fed, and then we'd both probably go down our platform at againstausterity.org, if you go to program, and implement the program right away. That'd be the first thing I'd do.
Throw out something that's not in the program that might be, that's just a personal interest of yours, maybe. Just to give an example of something that the elite will never do, but you think needs to be done.
I would immediately take the curriculum of all the private best boarding schools. I would take the curriculum of Exeter, Andover, and Eton, and I would study that curriculum, and I would get the best educators from those high schools, and I would implement every single thing that those elite high schools have in every public school in America. And I would build an equivalent of the exact same libraries each of those institutions have in the public schools. And then I would take the way that they teach, meaning in a public school you sit in rows and seats looking up at a teacher. In a place like Exeter you sit at a thing called a Harkness table, which is a round table where all the students sit around it. I would take from A to Z, I'd put it into every public school. That would be one of my things. Yeah. So that education wasn't for the elite.
It's funny, I was going to say something similar. I mean, and you can even look at these...
no.
Well, no, really, you can look at these other things like Waldorf schools or Montessori schools or what, why is it that people with money get to be free and have their kids free to think and free to explore and free to, figure out who they want to be in life, and then all the kids in public school get to sit in a row and shut their mouths and listen to some football coach tell them, read out of a book about U.S. history that was written by, some board of, or, some panel of a textbook company. It's just insane.
It's insane. Yeah, I would add exactly what you said. That would be what I would do for high school, mimic Eton and Exeter and Andover. And then for elementary school and kindergarten, I would mimic Montessori, Waldorf kinds of schools. Yeah. Mixed with classical education. I would study that, and I would make sure that I made the right mix, and then I would have free university. Well, we have this in our program, but making state, community, vocational, and city colleges free immediately. And then private schools would have to probably drop their cost. And for private schools, I would allow 0% student loans from the Federal Reserve.
I would say if I...
This is our own little utopic zeitgeist show.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, and what I'm going to say is sort of similar, but it just goes to show you that what everybody really wants is freedom. We do want... I think the libertarians are sort of right in one sense that what humans really want is liberty to be able to pursue happiness, for lack of a better...
And I would posit that the thing that takes away your freedom the most is a lack of an education. And I know that's been said before. People always say, education makes you free. No. I'm talking about the type of education that blows apart class boundaries. Yep. Where anybody could be mistaken for an aristocrat.
And what I was going to say, though, is that liberty is a goal, but liberty is not the method.
What are the libertarians are talking about? They kill funding for any of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
What are the libertarians' version of freedom? Running around with a gun?
Right. No public schools, no post office, no Medicare. Just basically you're on your own, which is going to turn it into Planet of the Apes in about 10 years.
That's not freedom.
Right.
Freedom isn't the freedom to smoke a joint and have a gun and not have the police, stop you from smoking a joint and having a gun. Right. That's not real freedom. Freedom is the ability to walk between classes freely. Seriously, people don't really understand that, but that's real freedom. The freedom is to think of an idea and be able to make that idea a reality and not have any barrier because you are exactly on the same level. You've been educated exactly the same as any elitist. Because believe me, elitists can see that the rest of us are different than they are. And that comes from our education. It starts with our families, of course, but that can be made up for with great schooling.
And what I would say, which is also going to sound like I'm a libertarian, is to get into this whole area of health freedom and things like that, where I would say you've got to shut down the entire medical complex. We could do a whole show on this, Now, what I mean is the way that it's being done. What you don't want to do is say, no health care for anyone, we're all going to use homeopathy, because then you'll all die. I've had several life-saving experiences with medicine. Like my wife had an emergency C-section with my first son and had like dangerously high blood pressure. She would have died. My son needed a heart surgery. He would have died if not for, there are people all the time are saved by medicine. It's just, some of the stuff they can do is amazing, but the problems are it's too expensive because of Wall Street, for one thing, because of the perverse incentives of the insurance industry, because of the perverse incentives of these health management groups, the pharmaceutical lobby. Basically you've got a cabal of people conspiring against you to profit off of you being sick. Even before you can have a good education, you need good health, and why should there be any profit motive involved in there, other than people being able to make a living as a doctor or whatever. So you could start with publicly financing medical education so not only the elites can become doctors. Mm-hmm. You could move on to nationalizing drug research, and I'm serious about this. I think there should be no such thing as a patent on drugs respected in this country. I think it should be done through grants at national laboratories, through consortia, through multinational cooperation, and you just license out the manufacturing of it to companies, but you do not want to let GlaxoSmithKline and Merck and Pfizer and all of these companies that literally come out of like the Nazi drug complex tell you what you can and can't have and how you're going to fight cancer and how you're not going to fight. Seriously, go to the website for Merck and pull up their board of directors and look at where those people come from. Every single one of them comes from a Wall Street hedge fund, an ad agency, or a competing like Fortune 500 company that's in something like oil or telecommunications or public relations or things like that. It's a cartel. Do you really think those people care if you have a good outcome from cancer, or do they just want to sell you $15,000 chemotherapy, let it drag on for a while, and then you drop dead and they move on to the next one?
Yeah, so nationalizing health research like we do with national labs for like physics and
absolutely. You can have private delivery. You don't have to have every doctor working for the government or even like the drug manufacturers, but you cannot let people monopolize information about how to cure disease and extend life and all that kind of stuff. I think you basically just need to radically open the floodgates on allowing independent investigation and independent information. And, you can't let people be silenced. But you look at all the things that get discovered and then are just shuttered by the drug companies because they can't allow that to get out because it's going to compete with the profits on another drug or whatever it is. With both of those things that we mentioned, that's not part of our program exactly, but it's like those are things that are only made possible through that program because you have a strong economy, you have a source of credit, and you have, in general, this idea that it's okay for the government to assert its power over private interests where the general welfare is at stake. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the idea, is you use your government as a representative of the public will to create the conditions in which you can have liberty. Mm-hmm. I'll come back to that quote, the Lincoln quote, where the sheep and the wolf are not agreed upon a definition of liberty. Is it liberty for the sheep, which means we're going to create a fence with that no wolves are going to come eat you so you can enjoy the sunny day and eat the grass? Or is it the freedom for the wolf to go around eating the sheep,
I'd really like to, moving forward with the show, get our audience more and more involved, because I'm getting scattered messages all over and on Facebook, and we get them in different places. But if people could ask themselves what their version of liberty is, because of this idea that people have been down so long they don't know what up is, I'd like people to start to think about possibility. And if they could write to UnitedFrontRadio@gmail.com, because we've all been down so long. The United Front Against Austerity and the Tax Wall Street Party are an international coalition. I'd like to take the last few minutes and visit our brother in arms in Ireland, Patrick McCarthy,
who will be running for Dublin City Council, which is the equivalent and can lead to being the mayor of Dublin, what he would do if he was suddenly thrust into the position to rule the world.
If I was given the option, let's say, to be a benevolent dictator, if there is such a thing, I would actually go about setting a term limit on myself of 6 months. And I would spend that 6 months working rigorously to restore democracy in its true form. Its four core pillars of democracy.
Which are?
Of course, there is the rule of law, popular representation, suffrage, and individual liberty. Now, let me explain each of those things. That is firmly restricted or limited by a legal relationship between the government and the governed in the form of a constitution. Okay? I am a big believer in restoring a nation's constitution. And if you don't have a constitution, like the United Kingdom, for example, I'd also abolish monarchies, so just be the United Place until we can come up with a better name. I would insist that you get one. You can write it. I'm not going to write it for you. I'm too busy. I've only got 6 months. So I said I've got to fix Africa, and that place is a complete poop house. No thanks to white European imperialism.
Right.
So I gotta undo that hot mess.
In 6 months.
I don't have time to be writing your constitution for you. Okay, I'm not that benevolent. Write your own constitution, but write one, and write one in such a way that it guarantees the fact that you need to have actual checks on power. Like the American Constitution, for example, or even the Irish Constitution, where I'm from. It's a holy document, and I don't mean that in the way of it being sacred. I mean that it's literally been left underneath the bed in a rat-infested apartment where it's been gnawed to pieces. Okay? And nobody can actually read what it says anymore. It needs to be taken out, dusted off, and we need to get some artistic restorers on that or something and actually see what it says, like those people who work on ancient documents that are found in the desert. Restore this and tell us what it says. Popular representation. This means that the government is regularly elected to represent the people who have the authority or power, well really the authority and power, to decide who governs. Which means Harry S. Truman used to have a little thing on front of his desk that said the buck stops here. Liberals love to talk about that. Harry Truman, wasn't he tough? Yeah, he was tough. Dropping 2 nuclear bombs on defenseless people. Tough guy. But he used to have like a little sign that the buck stops here. And in a weird way, he was telling the truth to the American people. Because what he was saying was, no, the buck doesn't stop at you. No, it stops at me. Well, it actually stops at the guy in the next room who actually, tells you what to say and do. But I like to pretend it stops at me. It certainly doesn't stop at you, though. Now, suffrage. What does suffrage mean? Daniela?
Voting. Women's right to vote.
Okay, now, suffrage needs to be free, it needs to be equal, and it needs to be universal, okay? This means we need to, restore the right to vote to people who are felons, okay? All right, let's talk about this. We need to stop disenfranchising people who committed minor crimes in the past. And I'm saying minor crimes, okay? So anybody who writes into the show, Patrick is not saying that murder is a minor crime, okay? I'm saying minor crimes, lowercase felonies.
During these tax Wall Street Party elections, it's amazing how many people come up to me and say, it doesn't matter, I can't vote, I'm a felon. I'd say it's almost 1 in 3. So many people in America are felons.
Yeah, and black people are not 1 in 3 people in the United States. We talk about the fact that this is a mass disenfranchisement of the working class, okay? And there are white working class people. But so we need to restore this, because there are lovely people who effed up when they were younger. Why should someone have their right to vote taken from them?
Okay, but we're running out of time, so what would be your overriding one thing, your eminent dictatorness?
Okay, I would eliminate all aristocracy and redistribute land to people who are landless. I would eliminate private property, not to be confused with personal property, okay? Nobody wants to come for your toothbrush. Yes, we want to come for your factory.